All right, I apologize. Had a soccer practice right before this, and it took me longer than I thought to get over here. Maybe not the wisest decision, right? Give me a second. Let me grab my notes. Get over to the lesson. You know, I was asking for the clicker, but about 3:30, I went and looked at the slides, and I thought there was more to them. So I'm not going to get a lot from the slides. I didn't add anything to it. So, to be honest, had I looked at them beforehand, I probably still wouldn't have added anything to them. So, but we'll have it up there nonetheless. The lesson 8 kind of takes a little bit of a different turn, I think, as far as when we're considering wisdom and what we can learn about that, how we might apply it, what it looks like, how to obtain it, and all those types of things, where prior lessons have been about just that. What is it? First steps to it, how to recognize it, kind of maybe the byproduct or the external manifestation of having wisdom or observing someone that does have wisdom, what that might look like. Well, this lesson kind of flips it inward a little bit. Not that there's not a correlation of, obviously what's on the inside will be manifested on the outside, but it has a lot to do with the conscience. And the more I say conscience, I'll probably mispronounce it for some reason. It's a strange word when I say it, but I have 2 classes to get through this. I've never finished on time. So I'm going to try to do that. There's really, if you look at the lesson, there's really only like 4 sections. And so I'll just split it right down the middle. We'll go through, hopefully maybe the volatility of the conscience, and get through these first 2 sections that are past the intro. And then on Sunday, we'll continue with the last half of Proverbs chapter 14, which is what's being covered here, and the last 20 verses or so. I didn't go verse by verse. I kind of went with the author's theme here, rather than breaking it down verse by verse, because it's just so much. I know I couldn't get through it if I did that. But we will look at specific verses and things like that. I'm not too worried about getting through the lesson. I have a lot of material, but I think what I've observed throughout these lessons is there's a lot of participation. I think it's a subject that is, I think, better when discussed out loud, and you get other people that are certainly wiser than me that have input, that have more experience in life, that can offer that type of thing. And so by all means, feel free to speak up. I'm not too worried about covering every detail that we could in Proverbs chapter 14. And so we'll look at these first 2 parts. The open mind finds wisdom, and the volatility of the conscience. And we'll, keeping the conscience in mind, that will mainly be the focus. Because when we talk about the introspection piece of that, our heart, which causes us to think, when we are in any decision-making process, we consider whether that decision is right or wrong. And sometimes it's frivolous, and sometimes it has more to do with spiritual matters. But that's our conscience that we've been given and have trained to know what is right and what is wrong. And so I think it's a very important subject, and so we'll kind of tackle that. He starts off by recapping the prior lesson. I wasn't here on Sunday, but there was like 3 or 4 chapters being covered there, and so I'd imagine y'all went through them pretty quick. But he kind of recaps and says, talking about the qualities needed to gain true riches of wisdom. What are those qualities? It's just that first, sentence in the book. And the reason I ask that is because I think a lot of them have to do with the conscience itself as well. Dedication. Dedication. He says dedication, diligence, and discernment as we lead into the conscience. What is dedication? What do we mean by dedication? It is the desire to do what is right, which would be putting your mind to it. This is what I'm going to do. So much so, I thought of Galatians 6 and verse 9, where we ought to have a dedication that Paul warns them to not become weary of doing what is good, right? They're focused on what is doing right, and there may be a temptation to give up on that. But instead, we are to continue to fight the good fight, to finish the race. Hebrews chapter 12, a verse that I think that we're all familiar with, says, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." And part of that is going to take wisdom, especially if there's the endurance piece of it. How we are to navigate our daily lives, navigate our decisions, navigate whatever it may be. How does that pattern fall in line with what God has laid out for us? And then secondly, diligence. What do we mean by diligence?
Giving your every effort.
Yeah. It's a careful and persistent work or effort, like you mentioned, right? It's forethought when we're putting in our work. It's not just mindless work, but there's a purpose to it, right? What is our attitude towards that work? What are we trying to obtain? Is it physical or is it spiritual wealth? Because in the prior lessons, what we've kind of gleaned from that is, if we are wise, well then, and follow God's laws and instructions, there will be a spiritual wealth that comes with that. And of course, I think the byproduct of that can be physical wealth, because we are instructed to work and not be slothful. We don't just wait around on the Lord like the brethren were doing in Thessalonica. We read that in 2 Thessalonians, where they were just kind of waiting on the Lord to return. No, we put our best foot forward to present ourselves approved to God and to show that we are a worker, that we ought not to be ashamed, that we can rightly handle the word of truth, right? Sound familiar? 2 Timothy 2:15. So we should make sure that we aren't just coasting. We don't just put it in gear and just go through life. There's an effort that is there. When we talk about training the conscience, it's the same type of diligence and the same type of effort that will allow us to discern what is right and wrong. And so he talks about discernment as one of those true riches of wisdom. What's a simple definition of discernment? How might we define that?
Able to determine what is right.
Yeah, so it's the ability to make a smart judgment about something, right? Smart judgment, what does that mean? Well, what is right? What does God have to say about it? Or what can we glean from the Bible in our own decision making? In lesson 7, if you recall, he kind of compared two verses, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, when we're talking about contentment. He compares that verse to the one who seeks, instead of hungering and thirsting for righteousness, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, he compares that to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9, where we have have the opposite. He says in verse 9, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmless desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." So you see a difference here where one is hungering for thirst and righteousness, and they're going to be satisfied. I think I just butchered that. Hungers and thirsts for righteousness, yes. For they shall be satisfied, right? They're going to have spiritual blessings. They're going to be content. Contentment is a major factor when we're talking about being wise. But those who run after worldly things are not going to be content, right? They don't have the type of wisdom and judgment and discernment on what they ought to be looking after. So we got to slow down and think about what we are pursuing. Are we pursuing physical wealth or physical things, material things, or are we pursuing knowledge and wisdom? I was reminded, I think we talked about this in prior classes too, but in Philippians chapter 4, he goes there with one of the questions, but we'll come to that one on Sunday. Paul himself learned contentment. He says in verse 12 of chapter 4, he's telling the Philippian brethren there, "I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." How has he learned this? What do you think? How is that possible? How does he learn to be content through all these things and all these trials, both without anything and with everything?
His faith in God. I mean, he knows God's going to provide everything he needs, so why sweat the little things and everything's little?
Yeah.
When you realize that we're spiritual beings, you know, when you have that full faith and confidence in God and that surety of heaven at the end, the physical perspective changes. You know, you see that God's plan is being carried out, and you know the things that bring you joy are spiritual. And being content is, you know, we know that God's going to take care of our necessities. And, you know, whether that's a bunch or a little of that moment, we're always satisfied because of our spiritual state.
Yeah, I agree. Chapter 4 is just coming right off the heels of what he wrote in the beginning in chapter 1, verse 9. Something that we talked about when we were going through the book of Growing in Grace. He says in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 9, well, actually, I didn't write it down, but if you want to look over there, he's praying for them that their love will abound with knowledge and all discernment. Right? So through that faith and that love, that wisdom and knowledge, he was able to learn that contentment. He looked at what the plan was for him through God. Okay. So,
and you know, it talks about those being qualities that we have, but all those are work. You know, that's not something you just sit down one day and say, "Yep, I've got diligence, I've got discernment, I've got dedication." It's an investment in time to do all of these things so that we can become more spiritual and do that. It's not something you just say, "Yeah, I am." It's how am I getting better at those?
right. So I agree. So as we get into the idea of the conscience and what is right and what is wrong, there's a lot of effort that goes into that, right? There's a lot of fine-tuning, recalibrating. We may take in new knowledge and have to look at ourselves, see how we are applying it. Are we listening with an open mind, as he talks about in that first section? So we'll get into that first section in a minute, actually. So talking about the conscience, what do we mean by that? Anybody look up the I just put down the definition of it. Anybody have anything on that?
Well, it would be ability to choose right from wrong. And, we use the heart because it's easier to say that than use your brain or your conscious, a lot of times. But conscious would be your ability to choose right and wrong, what you think. And it's not all the same with everybody. My conscience may be a lot lower standard than Glenita's or something, but it's our way of determining things. And, we have to use our heart. Without it, you would never make the decision to become a Christian or to realize that you're lacking in your life, But it's not our heart is not God's standard, or, you know what I mean? Because we always want to say, I just follow my heart. Well, your heart can be wrong.
Right, absolutely.
I heard in a sermon one time, a preacher made a comment that every person, man, woman, and child has a sense of ought. And that sense of ought just simply means that you have a sense of there is a right and there is a wrong. And the author's pointing out here that, it's what you're putting in to be the right that's going to affect your conscience. And we see that throughout Proverbs. And it gives us our daily living as far as what we're doing. Yes, there are spiritual things that are so important in the Proverbs, but more importantly, God is in this particular case telling us how to live while we're walking on this earth. And those things are just as important to help us guide towards the spiritual side as well. But that sense of ought is important, what you're feeding that sense of ought.
Did you want to add anything? Yeah, I agree. It's that inner feeling that voice that you have inside you that is telling you the rightness or wrongness of your own behavior. Did you want to add something?
I was just thinking of some of the couple of the scriptures. Paul said he had lived in all good conscience, and yet he was not right. He was doing it according to the old law, but the Lord showed him differently. And then you have those that could not eat meat, which didn't matter if you ate it or not, but if it offended their conscience, then they had to deal with that, and others were not to force that upon you. And so, it's something to think about, when you think of your conscience.
Yeah, speaking of Acts chapter 23, where Paul says he, after persecuting Christians, he did all that in good conscience, right? DJ.
When I think of the conscience or the heart, like Scott was saying, I think of Hebrews 4, when it talks about where the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of the soul and spirit and joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Like, our conscience can be trained, but we can, gauge where our heart is by how we respond to God's word, a lot of times, because we need to mold it around His word, because it is something that can be trained. Now, like Scott said, it might be at different levels, but if you're not ashamed of, let's just say, like, I guess modesty is a good example. If you just learned that, I need to cover more or whatever, in the beginning, it might not seem so shameful, but the more you do it, the more you train that conscience, or you train your eye to go, that's, something sinful. So I do think it is, something that you can train, kind of like Paul, like she was saying, it was trained wrong, but then it made it right.
Yeah, absolutely. When we get to that second section, we'll talk about that some too, about the idea of training, retraining, and calibrating our conscience, because that is something that can be done. And the author points out outside influences can retrain us on that. We look at the world today, we observe that, right? 20 years ago, just picking a sin, for example, homosexuality was something that was pretty much frowned upon by the majority of people, but now it's it's supposedly a good characteristic to be inclusive of that type of sin. And so as the world's standard of morality leans on itself, right, for its own understanding, we are to consider what God says about it, about wisdom, about knowledge, and to lean on Him when it comes to directing our footsteps. What about, talking about the conscience, is it something that is inherent in mankind? Something we're born with, a sense of right and wrong?
Yes, you perfect train.
It is, go ahead.
After Adam and Eve ate from the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, they knew that they were naked without anyone telling them.
Yeah, if you'll go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 2, I'll read from verse 16 in a second, but kind of going along those same lines is where I was headed, that, if we're created in God's image, His likeness, right, then we are going to share a rational nature as well. Not that we can't lean on our own understanding and make the wrong decision, but we do have a sense of what is right and wrong. Each one of us have the power to think, power to analyze, power to reflect on whatever abstract matter it might be. We're not defined by or confined by material attributes, but God being spiritual, John chapter 4 and verse 24, we understand that we are a spiritual people also. I think that, like what DJ had mentioned a second ago, and so that spiritual kinship makes it possible to communicate with God. Do you mind going ahead and reading that verse there in Genesis 2?
2 what?
16 and 17.
Sure. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die."
So, by that verse, we can tell that, we are decision makers. We are moral creations who can and do make moral decisions. There was a wrong decision made there, but we are choice makers. We can obey our highest instincts, or we can follow our most morbid urges, whatever they might be. And so I read one author had said that humans are the only ones that can say no to God. I thought that was interesting and true. We are autonomous as far as our individual self goes, and God endowed us with the freedom to govern our own lives, which by understanding that, we have decisions that are to be made. We have free will, which brings upon its own inherent risk. We can either follow our way, or we can follow God's way. We know which verse 12, which is a popular verse that's quoted here. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Nevin, did you want to add something?
But our conscience is trained from our youth by who's bringing us up. They're giving us those examples. They're teaching us those things. They're either teaching us the right things or they're teaching us the wrong things, and it could give someone a harder step to accepting God based on how it's been trained, or an easier step to accepting what God has said. So that comes into play as well, because that conscience is there. We're learning from day one how things happen, and unfortunately a lot of people are trained poorly. Their conscience, accepts things that aren't right. That doesn't mean they can't change, but that little voice in their head might not be saying the same thing somebody else's little voice is saying.
Yeah, there's plenty of people out in the world that have the ability to make right decisions without without ever opening the Bible, right? They may probably make some wrong decisions on certain things, but generally speaking, they may be good decision makers when it comes to God's standard. However, that's a result of their environment, most likely, right? Like what you're saying. They were taught these things. Maybe their parents had a level of morality, or they observed a level of morality out in the world, which all comes back from the very beginning, right? What we were told to do from the get-go set the standard of morality, although I think it may be backsliding a bit. Did you want to add something?
Paul was our best example of that. You know, he lived in all good conscience, you know, before he changed toward God. You know, he thought he was doing what was right for God, and it was wrong.
Yeah. Bit of a scary thought, right? So when the author talks about an open mind finds wisdom, when we hear things that we have not heard before, maybe here or another friend of ours points out a Bible verse or something like that, what do? How do we listen to it, right? Do we just discount it, or do we consider what God has to say about the subject and turn to the Bible like the Bereans did, right? Search the scriptures daily after Paul had taught them the word. So really the main point there is, I think, of at least the first half of this lesson is keeping that conscience calibrated. The author says here, I think a good quote is, one of the most important elements in living the Christian life is being honest with yourself. That one kind of rings home a little bit for me. Have you ever been presented with something that didn't, you may have been doing something in life that doesn't necessarily pattern itself with what Scripture has? What do you tend to do? Go against it. Justify it some way, right? You can justify just about anything, right? And the result's going to be, I think he talks about sorrow, bitterness, sorrow and grief. Galatians 6, I think we already went there once, but in verse 5, Paul says, let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. And then Romans 14:12, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. It is a requirement that we not only practice what we read in the Bible, but we examine ourselves as well. It's a continual examination to make sure that we have not been, I guess, I can't think of another word, but corrupted in a sense as far as our standard goes. Because, I started off with that a little bit. There are social contagions that are popular today that have no morality at all, do not belong in a Christian's life, but the rest of the world is going to tell you that that's okay. Okay, so that's kind of my intro. Oh, man. Go ahead.
I tend to look at a conscience as an internal compass. Because a compass always points north, right? And if our conscience is trained correctly, when we go astray and do things that are wrong, it should really bother us if we have the right conscience. And that conscience, if it's trained correctly, will cause us, and it will bother us, and it will eat at us until we make it right. And to me, that's when I think of a conscience, it's just, it's kind of an interesting way to look at it, but it's the little voice inside of you that says, you really messed up. You've something about it. And it doesn't go away until you make it right. Now, some people have seared their conscience, right? And they don't listen to that anymore. And that's when you're in trouble, is when you know what the right thing to do is, and you've seared it, and then you're just willing to do anything, and then it doesn't really matter anymore.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking of another proverb, as you mentioned. It weighs on you. Proverb. I can't remember. It's 20 something, but you know the one where you ought to train up a child in the way he should go, and he won't depart from it. I might have butchered that, but you get the gist, right? Not to say that if you do train up your children in the way of the Lord, that they won't make mistakes and they won't depart from it. But what you have done is train their conscience from what is right and what is wrong. And if they do make mistakes, that's going to weigh on them. They're always going to think about it. They're always going to know in the back of their mind, man, I may not be doing something right. Randy.
I think about Romans 12:2, talking about young over this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And that's through Scripture. And one of the things you made a comment about a few minutes ago was there are things that are pushing us today, things like homosexuality and transgenderism and things like that. And the issue that the biggest challenge, or something that I face every day at work even, is we're being made to feel like we're immoral. Like the concept of morality is actually changing. So it's not the fact that we're standing for something, it's actually that we're wrong for standing for something. So that's where, when we think about our conscience becomes the things that we put into our minds, whether that be our environment or that be the standard that we hold ourselves up against. And so I can't help but think of Romans 12 too. I mean, it's when we're using the world and we're conforming to the world, and that's what's driving me to know what's right and what's wrong. And I start to call things wrong or sin, or it's not a concept of sin in the world, but wrong that are truly right. And it's a complete reversal of the standards of the Bible, which is what we should be doing to renew our minds, and that's where our conscience should come from.
Right.
I was just gonna give them my point of view of the conscience side. When I was being brought up, I was taught that the conscience is not a good guide, and it's not in man to know his path, and that's why we seek God, that we don't follow our conscience. So I'm hearing two different stories, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm on the right path on that. But as what I was taught is your conscience is not your guide, and it's not a good guide.
I'll add to that if that's not what you're going to say.
Well, going back to conscience is real similar to, I've heard it compared to an alarm clock. When it's set properly, it's an awesome tool. If you're supposed to get up at 6, you set your clock, you set your alarm at 6. 7 o'clock, you wake up and you're like, why didn't it go off? I have it set at 6. Well, I set it at 6 p.m. and not 6 a.m. And so I set it improperly. So it wasn't, even though it wasn't.
Well, your mind got trained to hearing that noise, and just.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Then I can also sleep through it and ignore it and not listen to it, even though it's set properly. And that's another issue as well. But it in and of itself is an awesome thing to have, in that when it's properly used, that's why God blessed us with it. Is so that when we have our heart, conscience set properly, we will follow and do what He wants us to do.
I think God inherently put within man this ability to know, like what we're talking about, this conscience. And it's what differentiates us from animals and, knowing these moral things. But it is, and we've said it, it's been said many times already, it can be tarnished or honed at a very early
then that will grow and fester in that person's life to where they don't see that. They've never seen that as wrong because they didn't while they were young. And so it can be a good guide, but it has to be based on truth. In the same way that a map is going to help you get somewhere, if you have the wrong map, it's going to lead you down the wrong path. It can help you. It's the reason that God gave it, like Steve said, gave it to us. But it has to be honed according to the Scripture, or else it'll lead you astray.
Yeah, we didn't get much into the scripture part of it yet as far as chapter 14 goes, but we'll do that on Sunday. And, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying at all that, my conscience is my guide unless I have trained it to pattern, the Bible, that I know what is right and wrong, and then I'm looking to go back, a deliberate process, right? It takes effort to go back and consider what God might have to say about that subject, right? In all my thinking and thought process, I need to consider, is that me? Is that me following my own steps? Like you were talking about Jeremiah chapter 10, where the prophet there talks about it's not in man's way to direct his own steps, right? And so we see from the very first 3 verses of chapter 14 that there is God's authority and then there is following man's own authority, essentially with those first 3 verses there, which kind of set the stage for the rest of the chapter. And I didn't get close to that, so that's a bummer. But I'll catch up on it on Sunday, and we'll get through that. But we will spend more time on patterning that conscience, and what can we look at to train it? What are some verses? Maybe understanding our own human element of it as well.
Jeremiah 17, verse 9, it says, God tells us that the heart is deceitful above all things. And so I think part of what that tells us is we should never be happy with what our conscience tells us, with what our heart tells us. We should continually compare it to the Scriptures because the heart is deceitful. We can convince ourselves of something, like Paul convinced himself of something, and he was dead wrong. He was highly educated, he was intelligent, he was trained, and he was wrong. So the Scriptures is a standard. And yes, we can train our conscience to know the Scriptures well enough to know when something doesn't pass the sniff test. But going into every situation knowing I could be wrong about this keeps us humble enough to keep looking back to God's wisdom to find out what the true answer is supposed to be.
Yeah, I agree. Peter also, right, in Acts, when he fell asleep and basically take the word to the Gentiles, right? The eating of unclean meats, right? That was something that from a young age he was probably trained. I can't do that, right? But there was new guidance, and he had to retrain his conscience. You see the effect of that in Romans chapter 14, I think, too, of just the laws of liberties. It's a retraining of the conscience. And so I know there's a lot of comments that I didn't get to, and I'm not going to go over this time, but we will get into more of the meat of the conscience piece because I didn't get as far as I thought. So if you have anything else to add, just save that for Sunday. Thank y'all.